myself, I'm Bonnie Zabel, so it's my son that was 16, and tried as an adult. He had no malice, he had no intent for there anybody to be any harm, but somebody died during the act of what your son was involved in. And since Michigan has felony murder, which means during the act of a felony, doesn't matter how that person died or what your son's involvement was in that. So I went to American Friends Service Committee, and this guy here to my left was connected to them. And they showed me he wrote a book about his experience, and I wrote that handwritten, because it says you're not allowed to copy anything and send it into the prison. So I hand wrote like 70, 80 pages to my son to maybe have him an outcome. He was suicidal. I mean, I was just dealing with, he just didn't expect that going to do what he did and that somebody would die, that he would get a life sentence. It's just not even in his realm of that day. So, so that forever changed. But I wrote that to him, and my son decided to write to Patrick here because he just didn't seem alive. He already was thinking, I'm never coming home. He wrote to this guy here, and this guy took the time to write him back. And that changed my son's perspective. And he said things like, it may not be the life that you thought you were gonna have, but you can have a life. You know, you just need to not put yourself in these walls that you're comparing. Your mind is never, they can't take your mind. They can't take your ability to learn and to develop and become what you know you can be. And that changed my son's perspective 6 months into his county bid, that he could do this and he could get through it, even if he has to do all of his 32 and a half years. Thank you.
So, I was repeating again, my name is Patrick Kinney, and she saved my life, her son saved my life too, because I was serving life in prison, and the one thing she didn't make clear from that story is I was in prison when he wrote me, and I wrote him back. And I was at one of my lowest points at the time. I had about 18, 19 years in at that time. And there's a whole series of events that I ended up in segregation, even though I shouldn't have been, and they admitted later that I shouldn't have been. It was a whole, I'll tell the story another time. Pete Martell can tell you that story too. He was integral to that. But anyway, so I was at a very low point, and her son wrote me, and I was 16 when I got locked up, and I spent my first 8 months in solitary confinement because I was in county jail. This was in 1995 in Genesee County, and back then, most of the prosecutors, and still some of them now, are not as progressive as some prosecutors, not as open to the reality of the situation and what really happens when people go into prison and what happens to them, and that, you know, prison isn't a prescription to reform anybody. You know, if anybody has any misconceptions about what prison doesn't reform anybody unless you're very self-motivated, you have a lot of family support, like Brendan has, and you are lucky. You know, so luck plays a lot into it. And but I knew where Brendan was at, and I told him what I had learned, and he helped me learn it again, is that no matter where you are in life, and this applies out here too, to everybody in life, that no matter where you're at, there's always something good to find in your situation. You can always find hope, and you should focus on the positive in your life, because otherwise you just, you know, why not? Why not? Why focus on the negative? And you have to be positive about life. And I found at that moment that he wrote me, I was at my lowest, and it helped me find hope again and realize that I could do something with my life. I thought I was going to be in prison for the rest of my life at that point, and I realized, you know, I can at least do something good and help this guy out and help his mother out and make them feel better and help them get through what they're getting through, and it helped me find meaning to my life. I have a similar story to, you talked about the guy who wrote the Supreme Court briefs and got granted. I wasn't that lucky. But I became a jailhouse lawyer, and I helped, very early on I started fighting my own case, because most lawyers who do criminal defense appeals aren't very good at it. They don't really put in the time and effort, and they get bowled over by the prosecutors, and the prosecutors, assistant prosecutors who really know what they're doing, and who really take the time to do an effort, and most criminal defense attorneys don't. Because they're not getting paid anything for it, and that's what it really comes down to. I work at a criminal defense law firm now where we put in the effort, law office of Moffit and Associates, and so I taught myself the law while I was in there to fight my own case, and a lot of other prisoners hired me to help them out. And I actually started making an argument on I was sentenced to parole life. But what a lot of people don't know is parole life in Michigan, technically you can be released after 15 years. The parole board has jurisdiction, but for a long time the parole board had the policy of life is life, and they wouldn't release the parole lifers. So even though I was sentenced to parole life, I realized early on a lot of guys in there who had been there forever, who had been serving parole life sentences, they said, you're never, you better accept it now because you're going to be in here for the rest of your life. And that was a tough pill to swallow, so I never accepted it, and I kept fighting for my freedom. And one of the arguments I started making after Miller versus Alabama was decided in 2012 is that my parole life sentence was equivalent to life without parole. The Michigan Supreme Court disagreed with that argument last year in another case, and ruled that all parole lifers have to be resentenced. Juveniles have to be resentenced for 20 years. But what I want to say is that a life sentence isn't the only problem. Like Brendan was sentenced to 32-year minimum sentence. And I don't know, a lot of people I don't think really understand what that means in Michigan. What that means is you have to serve 32 years before the parole board can even consider you for parole. And there are a lot of people serving minimum terms that are over 20 years. And if you talk to somebody out on the street, even guys who go to prison, because I was in there for my whole life, and guys would ask, they would ask, how much time are you doing? I would say, I'm doing life. So what's that, 20 years? No, I'm doing life. But most people think life is like 20 years or 10 years. They think you get a chance after 10 years or 20 years. And that's really not what it is. When you're sentenced to 20 years, you have to do 20 years. When you're sentenced to 30 to 60, you have to do 30. Your sentence is really 60 years. If you're released at 30, that's an early release, even though your minimum term, that's technically in the law, that's an early release. You're paroled. Parole is early release. So what these bills would do is make all people under the age of 19 eligible for parole after 10 years, which makes a lot of sense to me because, as Bonnie was saying, after you do 10 years, you should be considered for parole. It doesn't mean they have to release you, it just means they have to start considering you for parole. And they don't have to release you until you've done 60 years. I don't think that's radical or, it's not, we're not saying we're going to release everybody. We're not saying we're going to release people. And I don't think it should just apply to juveniles. I think it should apply to everybody. Because after 10 years, after 20 years, most people age out of crime. That's the truth. And there's been a lot of research on this. A lot of people age out of crime. And I just want to say one other thing because somebody asked something about interrogation tactics. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done on police interrogation tactics because the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that it is legal for the police to lie to you as a suspect in interrogations. It's legal to do all kinds of dirty and underhand things that most people don't realize. So we have a client, I'm not going to say his name, but he was 14 years old when he was picked out of a lineup by a victim who she admitted he had never seen him before. She had never seen him before. She picked him out of a lineup, a 14-year-old black man in Muskegon County, and the police interrogated him, and they said, look, we have a surveillance video showing you did this. We have your DNA at the scene. We have all this evidence. You better confess to us because if you don't, you're going to go away for life, and you're going to get some mercy if you do confess. This kid is 14 years old. And at first he's denying it. He's denying it the whole time. And they just keep telling him. They keep telling him this. eventually he repeats back the story to them that they told him. And he's our client right now. He's doing 20 to 40. You know, so that's something, there's lots of things that need to be fixed about the criminal justice system. We need to look at what our goals are. What are our goals as society with the criminal justice system? The courts say that our goals in sentencing a criminal defendant are rehabilitation, reform, punishment, protection of society. There might be another one in there. All those things, and we need to realize that, you know, we have the balance right now weighted very heavily toward punishment. And a lot of studies have been done on victims of crime and what they feel about long sentences. And most of them say that long sentences don't really make them feel any better. Yes, we have to punish the criminal offender, the people who commit crime, but you know, it doesn't make the victim feel any more whole, sentencing them to 10 years as opposed to 20 years, as opposed to 30 years, as opposed to life. We have other goals as a society that we need to look at and that we need to focus on, instead of just putting people in prison where they can learn to be, you know, fall into gangs and other things like that. So I'm very pleased to hear that, you know, there are people in it, there is such a thing as prosecutorial discretion too. Prosecutors have the choice, even though her son was charged with felony murder, prosecutors have the choice of what crime they want to charge. And so even though technically he could say to her, well, yeah, he's charged with felony murder, I can't sentence him. I can't agree to a sentence of 10 years. Well, the truth is that you can agree to any plea agreement you want. You can decide what charge you want to charge. Prosecutors basically have a blank check in what crimes they want to charge. They have a lot of power, and we elect the prosecutors. So that's something that we need to think about, and people need to get out and vote. So I think that's all I want to say.
Thank you very much.